Look, I'm making all things new.
Look, I am making all things new.
Look, I am making all things new.
Look, I am making all things new. Look,
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 I
I
am
am
making
I
making
am
all
making
all
things
all
new.
things
things
new.
new.
Greetings. I'm Alona Street Stewart from St. Paul, Minnesota, Synod Executive of the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, and along with the Reverend Gregory Bentley of Huntsville, Alabama, I am co-moderator of the 224th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. We offer our great appreciation to everyone who planned this annual APCE event in order to equip those who are called to ministries of education and to be able to offer great tools to share professional knowledge and empower Christian formation. Thank you.
Blessings to you, all our brothers and sisters at APCE from the Christian Reformed Church.
To our many friends at APCE from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, greetings and many blessings.
On behalf of the Moravian Church Southern Province, our 54 congregations, our pastors, and our church educators, I bring you greetings for this 2021 APCE conference, and we pray God's blessings upon your meeting.
Welcome, dear friends, to APCE, and grace and peace to you from the Christian Educators Reformed Church in America.
How excited we are to be able to bring you our very first plenary of this event. It is my honor and my privilege for you to get to know the Reverend Bruce Reyes Chow. Bruce comes to us from Palo Alto, California. He is a person who is so comfortable in the world of technology, and I know he is going to bring us just a wonderful message of inspiration and challenge.
Great, all. It is good to be with you. Love everybody's flexibility and adaptability for all the technology, and seeing the choices there. Quite interesting what you all think of me. It is, again, good to be with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can see some slides real quick as we begin our time together. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit for the next hour or so, and then we'll do some Q&A about this idea and this thing we've kind of discovered recently around an expanded table and understanding who we are as God's people in a very I don't want to even say difficult, but just the season of life in our culture, in our community, and the world. So I want to do a little bit of introduction, though, just so you all, just give you a little insight into who I am. I've been pastoring in the Presbyterian Church for the last 25 years. This is actually from my ordination 25 years ago in October of 95, I guess. I've been a church planter. I've been an interim. I've been a call pastor and was the moderator of the Presbyterian Church USA, the 218th General Assembly. So I've been around this space for a while. I currently am the pastor at First Presbyterian Church of Palo Alto. I'm an 80% pastor and head of staff in that language because I get to do other kinds of things. And so I'm excited to be in a place that's flexible and allows me to continue to do creative and things that kind of feed my passions, and pastor a congregation that is trying to figure out how to make our way in the world today. That was what it looked like before. This is what we look like now. This is my pulpit every Sunday. I've been at this church now for about a year and a half, and I've actually led more services online than in person at this point. So that is kind of my world. I'm a coach and consultant and speaker, and I talk and share and write on a lot of different things from church planting, technology, leadership. I do coaching with Clifton Strength. This is in the back area of the platform at Montreat Youth Conferences a few years back, which I have the privilege of being part of for many years. I've also been leading online communities for a while. This is a Twitter account that we used to have about over a decade ago, where we had an actual Sunday worship where we had, and some of you may have been involved with that, where we led worship on Twitter every Sunday with did the kind of traditional order of worship and walk through that. So I've been engaged in this online digital space for a while and love it. Some of you remember, I don't often share total pictures of my family, but some of you remember when I was moderator in 2008, my children there, Abby's in front of me, my middle one, and then Robin, my wife, is holding Annie, and Ev is on the right next to my mom. And this denomination has in some ways raised my family and me, and has given me a multitude of places to be grateful for your support and encouragement, challenge, all the ways that you have nurtured me as a denomination. So I felt it was kind of fitting in a setting like this to share with you just how thankful we are for that. We're also almost empty nested. So you see those 3 children there. We are now almost done. Or my oldest, Ev, has just started seminary. Middle is a sophomore at Scripps College, and our youngest will leave for Pittsburgh next in the fall, we hope. So I want to say thank you before I begin any of this, because again, grateful for my denomination. We have much work to do about a great many things, but I will say our church and our denomination have become more and more what I hope it to be in the last 10 years. And so for your walk with me and our walk together, and for all that we do and will continue to do, I'm grateful. So thank you all, and excited to be with you today. All right, so there's going to be a lot of information I'm going to share with you. I'm going to talk about pandemic and hybrid church, and thinking about this new understanding of the table. I'm going to start kind of thinking up high, and then we're going to land the plane and give some actual practical things that you can begin to think about. I would encourage you to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions. I'm not going to be able to track the chat while I'm talking, but if you use the Q&A at the end of this time, I will do about a half an hour of question and answer and respond to some of those. So let's go ahead and put stuff in the question and answer feature there that you have access to. You can also look at slideshare.net/BReyesChow. These slides are already uploaded there, so you can always go back and look at them. And then I'll be with you this evening, 4 o'clock Pacific time, where we'll do a little bit further chat. And then always you can get with me at Twitter and Instagram at @BReyesChow. And I'm using the hashtag APCE 2021 if anybody wants to go ahead and do that. And I'll get back to folks later. All right, so here's what we're going to do with my time with you all. I'm going to talk a little bit about just what we've been through, and just want to think about the way we have led our communities and the pastoral presence we've given them, and no matter what role we have in our congregations, and then discerning where we may be headed together next, like what is coming up, and then actually thinking about some practices and some postures for us to be able to move into the future and to think about the ways in which we engage. And so, again, I'm not going to say this is the way, but it's a way for us to continue to be the church. And then we'll do some question and response time towards the end of my allotted time. All right. So I want to start with a little scripture. So this is a scripture from Exodus, where Moses is beginning to build the tabernacle. In the Common English Bible, they use sanctuary, but you also hear it as a tabernacle. So this is the passage from Exodus 36, 1-7. Let Bezalel and Oholiab and every other skilled worker whom God has given skill, ability, and knowledge for the work of building the sanctuary do all that God has commanded. Moses then called together Bezalel and Oholiab and every skilled person whom God had given skill, and who was eager to come and do the work. Moses gave them all the gifts offerings that the Israelites had contributed to the work on the sanctuary. They kept bringing Moses spontaneous gifts morning after morning. Finally, all the skilled workers building the sanctuary left their work that they were doing one by one to come and say to Moses, the people are contributing way too much material for doing the work that God has commanded us to do. So Moses issued a command that was proclaimed throughout the camp. Every person should stop making gift offerings for the sanctuary project. So the people stopped bringing anything more, because what they already brought was more than enough to do all the work. I find this passage amazing as we think about our world today, because this passage, there's three parts of this that are important for me. Is this the whole idea of a tabernacle in this movable space of worship, in this movable space that we understand God speaks to us in special ways, that we do certainly understand God moves beyond wall and boundary, but this kind of building of a space that is not permanent, that it's something that's movable, seems to speak to our day today pretty well. And that those were unexpected offerings from the people, that there were unexpected offerings that, surprisingly kept pouring in, and that there was more than enough for the work of the church, for those who were called into this work and the skilled labor and the things needed to do, that there was more than enough. Now, how often do we actually experience more than enough beyond just a metaphorical hoping optimism and kind of just actually saying, well, there's more than enough in our communities? How often do we actually get more than enough? I think we have, as a culture, have a hard time with understanding what is enough. And here we're hearing a story of finally folks are having to say, we're good. And it's not even useless gifts. It's like, we're good. You all have stepped into this space, and you're helping to build this tabernacle, this sanctuary where we may worship God. I find these three things really pertinent for us today as we think about our future as the church, and what we can and will and have become as we move through this season of our world. I want to say, as I talk about this, that I think there's a danger that we often run into, and we talk about silver linings for this time in this season. But the reality is there are no silver linings to pandemic and the political upheaval. And there are things that have emerged that we did not know that existed before. But I loathe to talk about any part of this as a silver lining, because too many people have suffered. There is too much suffering. And what we have discovered, to an extent not known to us before, is the level of pain and division and distrust and violence and anger and oppression and marginalization. All of the things that we have known were there before, they have become even more prominent in our day to day. So we're not talking about silver linings, but what we're going to begin to think about is, where have our abundance made itself known? And where have we been able, in the midst of this, to see and experience the gathered body of Christ in expanded ways? So when I talk about this expanded table, or I talk about the hybrid church, I'm talking about these things that have been made known to us, that they were always there, and they were always ready for us to discover as God was revealing them. But this moment in our time and in our world has made it so that we were forced into recognizing things that maybe we were not willing to or able to see before. So there aren't silver linings. As much as there's been a veil that has been lifted up, there has been this kind of removing of a filter, of a blurring. There's been some clarity brought to us about who we are and who we can become. So the first thing I want to talk about is this: where we have been. The first thing I want to say is that as I talk with pastors and leaders and church workers all over, a lot of folks are surprised at how well our congregations have done during this time of pandemic. And while I know that there is a humble space that we want to say, but I actually also want us to just embrace the fact that our communities, if we have been doing our work well and have been leading our groups and communities, and however you've been called to do that, whether you're a musician, you're a pastor, you're an educator, whether you're on staff, whatever it may be, we've all been called into the space to facilitate and lead and partner with our communities, so that when things happen in the world, that we approach those with a heart and mind and soul that is open and agile, and figuring out ways to continue to meet God even in the worst of our times. And so I will often tease pastors. I'm like, well, why are you surprised? Like, don't be surprised that your leadership and your ministry, no matter how you've been called into that, again, with your youth groups or your Christian education programs or your mission trips or your preaching or your leading, whatever it is, that's all gone into this idea that, actually what we've been trying to do is prepare our communities for times when there is struggle, and that we can continue to be the church. So I just want to say, as we're going through this, I'm grateful for your leadership and how you have led your people, been part of your communities, and whatever role you've been called to, that just take a moment, not to be arrogant or prideful in a negative way, but just to be able to say, yeah, we've been able to do this because we have been equipping our people to be able to move through this time. But I want to speak to you as leaders, as those of you that are engaging in this work and have been, and talk a little bit about what I think we've been through as we head into the future of where we are headed. I kind of think about this as this low-grade fever that we've all had. Now, some of us spike and lower down, and we notice it and we don't notice it, but there's this sense of ongoing kind of just pulsing pain, or that I think we've all experienced, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. We of course have pandemic, right? That has impacted our country, our communities, and the world, just sitting over us all the time. Everything we read, our news, our feeds, all of that has pandemic to it. We have experienced a call to racial reckoning that many of us have always believed needed to happen, but has become at the forefront and has exposed painful realities of our country and the world. And so that is sitting there. And then there's obviously been some political upheaval. I don't know if you've been paying attention, that there's been stuff going on, right? So then we got that going on in the middle of everything else. Some of you, like myself, have experienced personal loss during this time. You know, my grandmother and another family member have died with complications of COVID. Some of you have had that. Others have lost loved ones that had nothing to do with COVID, but COVID has impacted the way that we can gather and grieve. Like, you've experienced personal loss. And then those of you that are here, have been called into being part of community and walking with your folks in a way that not everybody is called to. So we have all of these things that are swirling around our spirits that I think we just have to acknowledge that we can't manage our way out of this. We can't simply just pretend things aren't going on. And in many ways, you and I have to come to the realization and just say to ourselves and those around us that these are not normal times, and that we are not going to be able to function, be as productive, as efficient as we think we are supposed to be anyway, but that this is just sitting with us all the time. And this is not a lament as much as of a challenge for us to see this as a reality, that we are just sitting with a space in our world right now that even if we have the privilege to not experience it as directly as others, we're still sitting in it. For me, the cycle has been this, that when this all began, almost now a year ago, which feels unbelievable, like many of you kind of jumped right in and you figured out, what are your folks, your communities, what do they need? And out of a deep sense of care and concern for the people that we serve, we just jumped right in. We tried all kinds of things, whether or not people asked for them or not, but we wanted to make sure that our folks, whether it's our youth groups, our people, our volunteers, our church, whatever it is, we wanted to make sure that they were tended to, that they were felt connected to this community when we could no longer gather in person. We managed the heck out of this. We just, for those of you like myself, I started to think about all the productive things I could do so that people would stay connected, right? And I believed that I could just manage and process my way through out of this, because it was only going to be a few months anyway. We were going to get through this pretty quick, and I could just hold this intensity for that long. And I also discovered during this time is that grace, patience, and understanding, that it just was prevalent everywhere, right? So we had this initial stage of, here we go, let's do this. We got it. And then we all realized, dear God, this is not going to be done in a month. And it became clear that we were over-functioning, that we were getting overextending. We were starting to do, I don't know how many Zoom small groups I started, and was like, why are we doing, like, it just became this idea that we began to trick ourselves into believing, because we were staying at home, that all of a sudden we had all this much more time. and we began to get overextended. We felt overwhelmed. We, as leaders, we were trying to not be anxious and try not to panic, but we did. And then most of us, and I would assume at some point, you just crashed. And there was a moment of realization that this is not sustainable. And then for me, I'm like, okay, I'm going to do better next time. And then I just repeat the whole cycle again, right? We go through this because this unstable low grade fever is just not a place we want to be. And we feel like we can move out of it anytime we want. But then where I think we are now is we are in this really interesting moment, this exciting time almost, where we have come to the realization that we need to deeply embrace this time as the real new normal, whatever that normal is, in terms of the chaos is normal. I mean, whatever it's going to be, that this is now just how it's going to be for a long time, which I think claiming that is really important. And then we can reflect on how we have modeled adaptive leadership and practices to begin to think about how have we led well, how haven't we led well, what is it about the ways in which our communities have continued to find life together that has been helpful, and how can we move through that? And then now where I think we are is we can begin to reimagine and dream about the future. You and I are now in this space where we begin to think about who are we going to become and what are we going to become? And as leaders in congregations and communities, it is some of our role to help our people dream more, to help ourselves and our communities, not to pretend that there's nothing else in the world going on that's wrong, and not to lean into our privilege and luxury so much that we pretend that there isn't still struggle and pain, but to hold both of those things together, that many things can be true at the same time. We can continue to have this low grade fever and struggle and all of that, and we can dream about where we may be headed. Where is God leading us? So I'd love if you want to chat or share anything. What's keeping you grounded these days? You can put that in the Twitter or in the chat room. What is keeping you grounded? How are you feeling? How are you feeling today? Because that may change tomorrow. It may change in an hour, but how are you feeling? And then how is your community doing? Would love to look back on Twitter and see how you all are experiencing these moments today. But here's the question for us as we think about landing this plane a bit. Once our online community is no longer the only option for you and for your congregations, are we going to have the capacity to birth and curate and nurture and sustain a long-term digital space? I'm thinking about us as a community that we've experienced this place where for some of us, we've been in it a long time. Others, this is brand new. Others have dabbled. Others thought it was a fad, but here we are. What now? It's a huge question for us that we cannot simply gloss over or I think irresponsibly just see what happens. I think that as leaders of communities, we have to take some time and intentionality to think about how do we lead and become part of the process of discernment into what may be next for our communities and this expanded understanding of table. So I want to think about discernment, and because one of the things that I have experienced in the congregation I'm serving and with others is that there's this great abundance of ability to see and connect with people that we never had before. And there's a challenge for us to begin to think theologically about who we are as God's people. I talk about every Sunday, we have communion every Sunday in our worship. And I often will say, right, we have stood behind the physical table for decades and eons about and talking about the expansive nature, a metaphorical understanding that God's people, the body of Christ, are around this table, and we break bread because God does not know boundary or border or wall. And so we are in this community beyond those who are physically with us. And we have said that over and over again metaphorically. And now we have the opportunity to act, live, and love as if we believe this to be true. We can't say in one setting, God's people, we are connected to one another, and they're not even in this space. Whenever we had World Communion Sunday, right, we understood that there were people of faith people of our Christian family that are celebrating this communion, and we are joined together as this body of Christ, and then step into a digital space and say to ourselves, well, that's not the same. We're not really joined. This is a different space. Because the reality is we can either claim and understand that this table has now just blown open and wide, and those who simply have to click a link can step up and sit at the table with us. And so for us, as we begin to think about what is next, we have to think carefully about the choices we make as congregations as we move forward. I want to share a few assumptions, though, as I start talking about this specific kind of space. And this is how congregations, how we meet and gatherings, that's going to be forever changed. That now, if somebody says, if you have a snow day, we don't have those in California. But if you have a snow day, before it was like, oh, I got to cancel this. Now you could just say, for good or bad, you could say, well, let's just hop on Zoom. Let's just hop on Meet. Let's just hop on, whatever you're using. And people are like, okay, right? I mean, at a certain level, depending on how you've been able to do this, right? Whether it's hopping on the phone or whatever it may be, right? Now it's shifted the way we even think about the possibilities. That same time, the desire for our worship settings and the places where we gather, the building of that sanctuary, it is strong to get back to what we've always begun and what we always used to do. And I want to push on that if you are thinking about becoming this new way of being the table. I do know that church is more than worship. So I'm going to talk about worship and it's more significantly in a minute. But I don't want to say that church is only worship. There are so many ways that we manifest what it means to be church in the world. But for most of our congregations, this is a central space and a place of, I think, power and authority for us to move into what might be next. It is a place where we can begin to reimagine and revision who we are going to be as a people. I do want to say that worship is not a competition. And I think when we begin to get in digital spaces, because we have analytics and we have numbers, we begin to get into these numbers things and comparing how many people and all this kind of territorialism that is unhealthy and for our communities. But it is a way for us to engage and measure and how we evaluate our spaces differently. I do believe that evaluating how we connect with people is important. And I want to say very clearly, there's a spectrum of options for people, that context matters, and leadership, as you are thinking about what you are going to become, you have to translate that for your particular spaces. That there is no one size fits all. I'm going to talk about one particular way of being, but you're going to have to translate that for who you are and where you are and how that might play out depending on a lot of things. So the last thing I want to say as I talk about this hybrid space, this expanded table, is that I think it's going to require more energy and resources than we may assume, and that we all have to enter this time of dreaming and discerning with optimism and reflection. That I've talked with a lot of folks and they've said, well, we're just going to do hybrid worship without thinking about what it means to be hybrid, or we're just going to continue to do this without thinking about what it means for communities to genuinely move into this space and how much of a shock it's going to be to the system to do this long term when our municipalities and our culture is not mandating it for us. Again, we've stood behind these tables and now we have the opportunity to see if it's true or not. Right? When you talk about the table that is open to all people, all are welcome, are we really going to live that out as we begin to move into this next stage of our lives together? So there are 5 options that you can begin to look at. We have this in-person experience, right? That many have had. You have the Zoom only. There's streaming. There's in-person and hybrid. In-person and Zoom and hybrid. I want to talk quickly through the ways that we're beginning to think about in congregations. We're thinking about how we move into this next stage of gathering. And I'll just share these very, very quickly here. What most churches did before pandemic, right? This in-person only. That may be an option that some churches are thinking about. And these are not ranked, or these are not, there's no good or bad choice here. What I'm asking for people is you're thinking about what is next, and you're thinking about this table that you may want to expand. We have to be realistic about what we have the capacity to do, and what we are the pressures on who we're going to be. So some churches are just going to go right back to in-person only, which is fine, right? It's what we did before. You meet in one place. The positives are clear, right? You get to see each other face to face again. And hopefully we're going to be able to sing together at some point. And should you be hugging people, you get to hug. I mean, at some point a year, who knows when that's going to be, we're going to be in that same physical space. But for many places who you've reconnected or connected to new people, if you do only in-person only, what we're basically saying to those who have connected with us in this way is that you're not going to be able to be with us in the same way. And I think that is an important thing. Now, some will say, well, we've left people behind during this pandemic time. And I would say back to that, yes, that may be true. And we try to tend to those as much as possible, but we were leaving people behind before. With every choice we make, we leave somebody out. And we just need to be honest about that with ourselves and figure out a way in which we can move forward with as much integrity about the choices that we make. So we don't do in-person only simply because we've left out a certain group, without also saying, if we do this only, we are also leaving out this other group. And so beginning to have honest conversations is what I begin to think about, and what I challenge us to do. We could also do remote only, right? You could just decide, this is great. We're never going back into our sanctuary. Let's sell the building, but church online, right? That's all we're going to do. Well, that is certainly a possibility. We have a community, 3 generations of folks in our congregation that worship together almost every Sunday. One is the grandmother's in New York, the daughter is in Palo Alto where I am, and the son is stationed in Hawaii, and they're worshiping together now, right? I mean, there's some amazing ways to think about this remote experience. The remote only also limits, right? We've already seen how hard it was for people to connect. We want to see each other. We want to be in physical contact with each other. So that is a downside. So those are first 2. You could decide next, you're going to do 2 completely separate services. You're each able to focus on what each does well. The positive of that is you already know how to do both of those. Like you either pre-record or you're live remote, and you've done the in-person. So you can do both of those. You don't have to worry about blending or hybrid or any of these difficult pieces. So that's possible, but why not, right? Most folks, I think the biggest pushback on this is, but I want to get to know everyone. You're going to split the congregation. This is like that. If any of you have ever heard that, sometimes we argue about music in these, I think, false polemics of traditional and contemporary, right? And if you try to start anything new, then you're splitting the church. This is the kind of thing that would come up to that. So that's one. The next one would be streaming, right? You're decided we're going to center on our physical space, but we're going to allow folks into that space through technology. You're going to, and some of you are already doing this, but now you've decided you're going to do this even more, and you're going to be able to have some interaction, but people are going to watch people worship in the sanctuary, right? So the yes is you get a lot more touches and eyeballs on your worship. And I say that intentionally, right? People may see it more, but there's no guarantee they're going to interact more. And folks can just watch worship whenever they kind of want to, right? Once it's streamed and recorded and sent out, they can just watch it whenever. The why not is missing being able to interact with other people in worship, right? This interaction that we've experienced in many of our remote settings and in person, like when you stream, there isn't that same kind of interaction. So my final one, obviously, is hybrid. To think about whether in person or remote, it's a place where you essentially have the same experience. Why for me is because I believe in that table. I believe in that table that we have experienced now more than ever, the expanded nature of who we have become as a people. Now, why not? It's so much work. How do you even do this? This is one of those things. Our worship team is beginning to think about this. And one of our folks said, I looked it up on Google about doing hybrid worship, and there isn't anything. I'm like, I know, because most places are just glorified kind of robust streaming. as opposed to really trying to create a setting where everybody in the space gets as close to the same experience as you can as possible. So this is not something that's going to come easy for us, but if we want to open up the table, we're going to find ways to live out this hybrid experience in our worship and in our communities and our churches. So those are your 5 options. Just wanted to lay those out for you as we begin to think about, okay, so what next? What I would encourage you to do is to begin to discern and to begin to think about this with your communities and yourselves, right? This isn't something that is just going to happen. It's not going to simply happen because of my personal will as a leader of a community, a group, a church. I will it, so it's going to happen. That will be a sure way to fail. So I think we ask important questions of each other and our communities. What's the desire? What's the desire for your community and yourself? What is the desire that you have for the future of the congregation, the community? Do you have a desire to live into this new way of being that you've discovered over this time? Or is it just, it's not there? It's an important, vital question to ask. To think about the opportunities and gains that you might experience as a community in any of the ways that you may move forward. To think about here, if we choose this, if we do this, here is where we can see potential for growth in body, mind, and spirit and faith. Here are the things that will open up before us. And then, well, if we choose these things, here are the ways that we're having to make some difficult decisions because we may experience loss or struggle, or the obstacles may be too high. What are those pieces? One of the most important is to think about capacity for your congregation and your staff and your volunteers. Like, what actually is the capabilities? Many, I think one of the things we tricked ourselves as especially for those of us who lead worship or you lead groups, is that leading groups in person is the same as leading groups online, that leading a meeting around a table is the same as leading a meeting on Zoom. And what we've all discovered is that is not true. That it is so painful to try to lead a meeting on Zoom is the same way you would do in person. And I think that we have to acknowledge that most of us, this is not a muscle that we have stretched or built up over our time, that this is new way of being. It is a muscle that we are going to have to work out, and it's going to be sore, and it's not going to come naturally. And we all have to realize that if we're going to move in this direction, it is actually going to take some work to do. Now, I will say that some of you have probably eased into this because of your worldview and our experience. And in some ways, we've tricked our communities into thinking that it's pretty easy to do. And I think a measure of solid, leadership sometimes is that folks are like, oh, this just kind of happens. But asking this question of staff capacity or congregational capacity reminds us that this is not something we can simply ease our way into. To think about resources, technological resources, financial resources, that this is not just an add-on experience, that you have to begin to think about what is it going to take and what are we committed to? And lastly, and most importantly, what is the most faithful decision for the future of the community? What is the most faithful decision? Because that ultimately is the discernment. How are we listening to the mind of Christ and the will of God in these conversations so that we may move forward? I just did this a survey of about, it's about 30 or 40 questions, and I'll give you a link to this. For our worship team, we just had them run through this. So the level of desire for your communities, and what do you think we are as First Presbyterian Church? What's our level of desire for any of these options? And it was interesting, right? In person, the desire is super high. And hybrid was pretty high as well. Nobody wanted Zoom only, which is not a surprise. Streaming services, all kind of balanced, except in person and hybrid got pretty high marks for this. And the very high was that hybrid over there, which I thought was interesting for a congregation that is generally older, changing, but generally older. What options provide the best opportunity to engage with new people? And so in person, I think it was pretty balanced across the board. And it was interesting. Streaming was the least, right? That one was the highest, and new people were the two services in the hybrid. These are just a few sample questions. But I asked the question about which would take the most technical training, capacity building. Clearly, everybody thought hybrid would take that, which I was grateful for them to see, that hybrid in person isn't going to take a lot, right? That's the least amount. But I found all of this really interesting as we went through. I don't know, there's about 30 questions in the survey. And ultimately, the response for which would be the most faithful decision was to do hybrid, was to see this new way of being, which I thought was very interesting. Even though the desire for one thing might be something really high, a faithful decision was something else, which I took as a really positive way for a congregation to think about itself. So I'll share this links with you all, and we can share these with you later, but there's some work I've been doing around this and thinking about this as you're taking your communities through this. So again, chat, tweet, share, wherever you are interacting with each other, your initial reactions to the ways in which you might gather in the future. What's your congregational desire? What do you think it is? What's the capacity? And where might the Spirit be leading? So would love for you to interact in the chat. I can't track that. Again, put questions in the Q&A. If you're on Twitter, go ahead and do all that kind of fun stuff there. But we're gonna keep going. So I actually am starting to run out of time. So I'm gonna have to rush through this. So at the end of the day, part of what we just need to understand is that whatever you might choose, right? It's not going to be based on how technological you are. This is a mistake that we make, is that the more technological you are, the more successful you are. And we begin to fall back into these old models of monolithic thinking and competition and these ways of measuring. I've always believed that just because you have the power does not mean you have to use it. If you were to come to our worship service, we do not do a lot of anything extra other than leading in-person, in-the-moment Zoom worship experience. It's very simple. And so just so you know, right, I mean, as you're thinking about where you might land, the important thing for us as a church and as people of faith is how we are loving in the world. Where are we seeking justice? How are we caring for those who are isolated and alone? How are we feeding, clothing, releasing prisoners? Thinking faithfully about that and not about your level of technology. But here we go. I want to talk a little bit about ways to move into this space, the ways to shift your posture, and a few things that you can do to move into the space. I'm going to talk for another 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it for Q&A. So if you want to start throwing questions in the Q&A, please feel free to do that. So here's the first one, is we have to reimagine over replicating. Now, those of you who are Presbyterian, you've been in our denomination a long time, it has not escaped me that I get to use the word reimagining these days, and people are not freaking out, and I'm not being called a heretic and all these things. For those of you that don't know, years ago, we had a gathering, the reimagining event, where the misogyny and sexism of our church was put on full display around many of my mentors, women who were seeking to expand our understanding of who God is in the world. And so I use reimagining, and every time I do it, I'm like, oh yeah, I mean, I can do that, right? It's years later. I identify as male. I've had roles in this church. And so for those of you that had to sit through and experience the worst of who we can be as a denomination during that reimagining period, thank you for still being with us. And for those who have had to leave our dear church, we lament that. In any case, reimagining now, we can actually do that to take advantage of the platforms, right? So beginning to think about, if you are moving into some different ways of being, don't just try to do what you did before, but just do it online. Think about the idea that if you actually changed the platform in your sanctuary, if you went from pews to chairs, like, it would change the way in which you could do gatherings, right? It expands the possibilities for how you gather and how you engage with one another. So how our space impacts our worship or our gatherings is really important. So we can begin to think about, this is what opens up not how do we do things exactly the same so nobody's uncomfortable. This is where the abundance comes in. This is where, like, there are gift after gift after gift to put people in a room and say, what happens if we take advantage of this space? So some of the things you can begin to think about, we get to embrace accessibility like never before. The ways in which we can engage with people, interpretation, sign language, we get to use different visuals. People can understand, they can use their own volume controls. There's you can have captions, all the kinds of things that we were not able to do before. All those different ways of connecting with people. This gives us an opportunity to think about what is central and what is not. What have we decided? Have we worshiped? What in worship do we worship besides God? We've been given this opportunity to really think about what is important to continue on. How do we do communion? Do we do communion? We have communion every Sunday on our Zoom service. Will we stop that when we go to a hybrid? I hope not. And so it's opened up this possibility that communion every Sunday is a gift that we've been able to experience. How we do offering when you can't pass a plate, which I have been a proponent of, stop passing the plate and figure out different ways of doing offering, that this has given us an opportunity to think about an important element of our order of many of our worship services. How do we respond to the word? How do we offer our gifts back to God? We now have these awesome, amazing possibilities. And I'll tell you, from a practical level, you can simplify your bulletin now. I mean, if you go to a hybrid space, like, we do not have our folks at all have to download a bulletin. It's a very simplified, I can almost walk everybody through without actually having a bulletin. The amount of time and energy and resources that goes into a bulletin, you get to simplify. That's very practical. You get to increase the use of visual and video content when you go to a hybrid experience, and you begin to think about the ways in which you engage people together, that you now get to plug in different ways of being from resources that you would have never been able to do that before. You can now bring in mission coworkers from all around the world into your space. You can bring your offering partners into your space. You can go into other space. I mean, there's just, the possibilities are amazing. Reimagine your space itself. How do you bring people in from a remote setting into a physical space, and the people who are in that physical space into that virtual space? There's all kinds of ways to begin to think about that, and to reimagine our role in leadership. Before, we were worship leaders, and now I think of more as, you're more of a DJ. If that want to make you feel even cooler, you're kind of a DJ. You're a curator of space, where you're creating this space that folks will experience God in. That think of yourself now differently. All right, so the next one is to decenter our geographic location. How do you talk about space itself? If you want to move into this hybrid space, you have to begin to think about the space differently. It's not just the physical space, but our place is defined by our theological perspectives, our cultural expression, and our beliefs. And people gather and are drawn to us because of what we believe and how we live in the world. And so now we can embrace it, that not just because we are down the street from them or we're in the community, but because there is something that actually draws them into it. So we decenter this kind of real church space and virtual space and just create it all in the same understanding of language. So just resist the desire and inertia to make the physical location the ideal experience if you want to go into this kind of world, because all that does is tells a remote person that, oh, I'm great. I should be grateful that I'm here. Like, they're giving me this privilege to be in this physical space, but it's not real. But part of what we do is we say, this is all holy space, physical, remote, all of that. Worship leadership should come from various locations. However you're gathering, if you want to move into this hybrid space, then leadership comes from hybrid locations. I plan, when we go into a hybrid space, that I will preach off-site twice a month. And I'll be on site twice a month. Either me or the liturgist or whoever's leading, there will always be somebody off site. So it decenters the idea that everybody gathers in a physical location and leads from there. But no, we're leading from all over because we understand the space not to be centered on the physical location. Change the understanding of how you think about space. If you do a land acknowledgement at the beginning of your worship, you can no longer say, we are acknowledging that the Ohlone were on this land before this church was ever built. because now you're able to kind of remind people from wherever they may be joining you, whatever couch, car, desk, wherever they may be, that the land upon which they are worshiping now, the indigenous peoples that the land was taken from, that you can now shift your language to begin to remind people in a variety of locations about the decentering of a particular space and an embracing of the realities of their particular space. So you have this local flavor from your particular congregation, but this global reach to begin to expand people's understanding. The invitation to leadership is important. Engagement and participation opens up when your geographic boundaries are let go. Do you have people, what we have discovered, they're recent grads, college students, they're relocated seniors who moved into retirement communities. There have been new connections that have shown a desire to connect with us more deeply. And now when we think about this hybrid experience, we have no problem inviting. We have our first round of members who are not living in our city, who are beginning to think about how to engage in this particular church, knowing that I'm never going to be there, but I can live out my faith in this community and the one I actually live in. And so now how do we invite them into leadership? Couple of ways you can do that. You value the voices of the remote and the new voices. That be intentional about inviting those folks into those spaces. When you are thinking about your committees, your task groups, your working groups, whatever it may be, if you want to take this seriously, invite people in who are carrying the voice of those who are not going to be physically in that space. That value them so that you're going to shift the way and how you meet so that they will feel like this is fully truly an ongoing space. And that's not just a matter of, well, we're glad you're not here physically, but we're going to invite you into the space. And then at some point we're going to meet in person, and too bad for you. You're actually saying we're going to shift the way that we are going to be by inviting you into this community. Engage what it means to be a member. You got to think about, again, this whole membership conversation is taken on a whole nother layer. What does it mean to be a member when you're remote? And invite people, again, to serve on things that are not going to be the regular people who have always been part of what you're doing, but are now bringing in a voice and a vision and a perspective of remote folks. And that way you get this much more intentional hybrid community, and expand the ways you think about leadership. If I could copyright one thing out of this time, was that we started using what we were calling tech deacons early on. And if you please liberate that idea to think about people who can tend to the technological needs of your community. And we have, in our community, we have a team of about 10 tech deacons from a variety of ways who help to lead worship, who help to host Zoom, who will connect with somebody on the phone if they're having a hard time getting in, whatever it may be. But to think about this as ministry, there are far too many technological people, some of you are here, who have been burned by this last 10, 11 months because everybody just assumes, oh, you're the tech person, just do the tech. See it as ministry, embrace it, recognize it, give people breaks, but to expand the ways that you see ministry. And the last one here is to engagement, and think about engagement as opposed to just simply membership or numbers, but to connect with folks in a way that will how do I want to say it? So to connect with people in a way that when you do something in person, that they've had such deep connections to people that they can do nothing but miss this other interaction, right? So you've had such a great online, virtual, digital interaction with people that when you start talking about in person, you don't have to remind people about so-and-so in this town or who reconnected. Folks will naturally, it's like, well, what about so-and-so in this town? Right? So you're creating and you're living this hybrid world in such a way that folks just see it as the natural progression of who we are as God's people, that the table becomes natural and normal, this expanded way, so that they yearn to be connected with people who you've connected with. All right, but specifically, measure and track your engagement. There's a little typo. Measure and track your engagement. You can do that in a lot of ways. It's one way to see how you're connecting with people. We are doing a thing where we're seeing if somebody shows up to our service 3 out of every 5 Sundays, we're taking that as a signal that they've somewhat connected us. So then we're going to send an invite and a welcome specifically to those folks. So there's different ways you can begin to do it, but measure it. honor affinities, create interaction that values life stage, curiosities, locations. So you're going to create diverse spaces. Not everything has to be hybrid. Do some that are all online, do some that are in person, and do some that are a mix of that. But create those intimate interactions that people can have together. Create those opportunities for folks to gather together in a way that is different than a big old meeting of 757 people like we are today, but a way that people can actually have those narthex or lobby conversations after worship that are casual and spontaneous. Create those as much as you can. Again, those casual interactions. Leverage this time to play. Use this opportunity that we've been given to think about different technologies, exploring different platforms that are coming out right now, to use this as a time to really explore different ways of engaging with one another, whether it's texting, whether it's different phone services. I know some folks are recording sermons and sending them over voicemail, and people can dial in and hear them. There's lots of stuff out there, but to increase engagement by playing with possible ways to engage. And finally, technological capacity. Determine your realistic ability to embrace all of this. Some of you are feeling super overwhelmed right now, and that's kind of my point. But to begin to think about, is this something that you and your community might actually have the capacity to do? Right? Can you handle, what can you handle? Does it streaming or your CRM, your databases, the other ways in which all of this kind of comes together means that you're going to need to invest and think about equipment, think about staffing, think about training, stretch the muscle that you've not had to use before, and practice, that you invest of your time and energy. Budget and clear time expectations are the indicator of your commitment. If your community says we're budgeting this amount of money and we understand that as leadership you are committing this amount of time, that begins to tell you how seriously you're going to take this possibility for what is next. All right, you can exhale now, and then we're going to do some Q&A in a minute. Again, the slides are all located at SlideShare at B. Reyes Chow. You can go ahead and find those at any time. You can, we'll share this out. I'll share this with Ann and Tom. You can find all the conversation and things that I've been leading and the survey itself at bit.ly. It's a BRC hybrid worship process. And then would invite you, if you are using Zoom, if you have not found our Zoom Faith group on Facebook, it's, I don't know, 2,700 people now that's grown, and we're going to begin to divide that out. And we do a monthly actual Zoom gathering to talk about practices and things. So I would encourage you to touch base there. And if you have any questions at all for me, at B. Reyes Chow on all the things, I prefer Twitter and Instagram, and I don't check my email more than twice a day. So, but you can go ahead and email me. And that just takes a while for me to get back to you, but B. Reyes Chow and all the other things. All right, so now we're gonna do some Q&A. So I am going to stop my share and pop up the Q&A piece. Woo, okay. Here we go. Let me look at our Q&A stuff. Sorry, all right. Okay, lots of great questions up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk through a few of them, and kind of I'll read out the questions as well. And so there's a lot of questions I want to. There's a ton here. All right. Just want to think through. All right, so I'm just going to pick and choose a few. I'm going to answer Heidi Bolt's question. Is worship the only place where hybrid is possible? Can youth events, committee meetings, fellowship events be hybrid? Yes. I actually think if you're not integrating all of this through the rest of your life as a congregation, then it almost rings false if you're doing it in worship. If you have this kind of robust hybrid experience in worship, but then everything else is back to the way it used to be, that's going to be an obstacle. Because if you are saying, engage with us in this space, you found us, this is one of the doors in which you can gather with us, and now you want to be engaged, oh, but sorry, you can't, because everything else happens differently. And this is why it takes a lot of work, right? This means that if you want to have a session that is hybrid, and we're thinking about this, right? If you have 2 or 3 people who are not going to be living in your city, it means that you have to change the way you meet. We've actually really enjoyed our session meetings. And for those of you not Presbyterian, our session, our governing body of the church, of a particular congregation, we now meet online, and I suspect that we will continue to meet online. We may gather in person and remote folks in on occasion, but it's great to be able to just roll into your room or your desk, have session for less than 2 hours, and then just stop, as opposed to this large scale experience that you actually have to have. So yes, and I think the more creative we are about other places, this is a time where folks are open to it. And let me say one thing about the Zoom fatigue. I actually believe that as soon as we have other options for interacting with people, Zoom fatigue will not be as strong, right? Because people were doing this far before pandemic, but you have the option of, in between your Zoom meetings, to maybe go have coffee with someone or go drive somewhere and not have to worry about all the precautions. And so at some point, the Zoom fatigue will go away. I really do believe that. All right, so that's done. All right, gosh, there's so much more stuff. All right, I'll do one question. Kathy Dawson, some of the questions that were put in the chat by others were, could you define hybrid as being different from streaming a service with Zoom? Yeah, so I'm being pretty strict about what I believe is hybrid. So streaming is where the physical location, some people are there and everybody else is kind of watching it, right? And so, but the center is the physical space. I'm talking about, and I rarely use the word pure, but kind of a pure extreme version of hybrid, which we are trying to get to, which I believe will be an amazing kind of experience, is that those who are in the physical location and those who are remote, you basically have virtually the same experience. That's why if we do this, I'll preach twice a month right here from where I've been preaching the last 10 months. And then 2 times I'll be on site. And so that folks kind of will get the sense that there's no favorite space, right? It's all one space and we all entering it differently. So whereas a streaming experience is generally focused on a particular space, right? Those of you that have your whole worship team has been gathering at your sanctuary every Sunday, right? That's more of a streaming experience, right? You're coming from a physical location and making that the center. And again, this is not bad. This is just the difference and folks are kind of watching into that space. So that's one of them. All right. There's a lot about this. All right. So educators, right? So yes. So let me answer this one. I feel like you're talking mainly to pastors about worship, but how does it apply to Christian education, faith formation? Yes, because that is my wheelhouse. And so, and the translating for how you as educators begin to do this, I think has a lot of the same thing, right? How do you create these spaces that take seriously the location and the physicality? How do you begin to create youth group experiences, Christian education, faith formation classes, adult ed? So one of the adult ed things that we've done, right, is we have brought in lecturers, folks from outside our city because we can. And so our Bible study on Monday evening, we've brought in somebody from New York. We brought somebody in from Philadelphia, and they led that. And so the possibilities for opening up how and who may lead particular faith formation experiences is the same kind of thing. How do you begin to open that piece up with folks? What are the ways in which you can gather your people in your communities in unique and these hybrid kind of ways? So what is your education committees begin to look like? Are those remote? Do those have remote people? I mean, same kinds of things. What are you going to do? I will say that I've not done youth group in a very long time. We don't have a youth group here, but those of you that are engaged in that work, how are you making these hybrid experiences? I've heard of some amazing creative ways that people are doing that. And I assume you'll be sharing that during your time. But so I'm hoping that you can translate some of this for your particular place. All right. All right. All right. Presbytery of Augustine, in your crystal ball, what do you see as the future for congregations that return to the way we used to do things normal? If they were struggling before, what will happen to them in the new reality? Oh, Bruce's crystal ball. You know, I am would hate to begin to think about here. So here's a couple of things, ways I respond to that question. One is there's a life cycle for every community, whether you are thriving now, you're shrinking now, whatever it may be. Like there's just a life cycle. And we as denominations, we don't want to acknowledge that. We just believe every community should live forever. And that's just a problem in general. So some of our communities are going to discover and have discovered that they are not going to be able to make it through this, whether it's financial, whether it's just energy and time, whatever it is, that's going to happen. There are also some communities have discovered new energy about being community, right? And so when they come back into full in person, they're going to be re-energized by this discovery about, oh, we can be the church in different ways. Like we're still the church. We actually never closed, even though we weren't able to be together. So I think there's this idea. I think we make small churches. I grew up in a small church. I come out of a small church. This is probably the largest church I've ever served. I think we force low self-esteem on small churches, and we begin to think we have this kind of mental thing that the only way to measure success is by numbers and growth, and that idea that if you're not growing, you're dying. We only measure that in numbers as opposed to other more values that we may have about a congregation. So we might be growing because now our community sees itself as vital together, and we've received some new energy to do some good work. All that said is there's an opportunity here for some of these congregations, groups that might be presenting themselves, that I would hate for this return back to what we used to be limiting for that, to say, here are things that we might not, we would miss out on. So I'm having conversations with a couple of folks about doing an activist social justice youth group that is across the country, right? That those of us who have very few young people in our congregations, and we would do a disservice if we tried to do a youth group or youth program, because we've done that over and over again and failed. But why don't we see this as an opportunity to build some bridges and some partnerships and some ways to gather our young people together in a way that actually makes sense? And it's the same, like there are just so many opportunities that I think if we frame going back to normal the same way as totally returning to what we used to be, then we have missed out on an opportunity. If we see it as this is a comfortable space that we can now see ourselves differently operating out of, that's a different perspective. So I would hate for us to miss out on possibilities. All right. How can this information best be utilized by educators who don't always get to make decisions about the modes of worship? Well, that is a problem for whoever's helping to make those decisions. I mean, I think you model that in the spaces where you have authority and power, and hopefully, I think when there are leaders who simply aren't open to the possibilities or have super high unhealthy control needs, because I think there are some healthy control needs, I'm not sure what to do about those folks. I mean, I wish I could talk with everybody and say, you should all be more open. So find the space in which you can thrive and live some of this out, so that others can experience and see, and you can model possibilities for other parts of the church. I hear too many stories about folks who their pastors or whoever's making those leadership decisions as the bottleneck and as the place of resistance. And I never want to be that. I want to be the place that's opening up and creating space and helping a community to think through it well. So if you're bumping up against that, enough conversation to have a healthy dialogue, but creating that space in other places where you have control and power and get to unleash your own imagination. I mean, I think that's a good place to be. All right, I'm running out of time. Here's a good one. Kathy, but doesn't this once again benefit bigger, wealthier congregations who can pull this off professionally versus small church with poor internet connection? Oh, I love this question. So poor internet connection is an issue, but I will say we have poor internet connection in the middle of Silicon Valley 2 times a day. I do not schedule Zooms because we are not dense enough to be able to. Anyway, so poor internet connection, certainly an issue. And so you're either pre-recording, you could work around that. But let me also say, do not fall into the trap of thinking that hybrid can only happen with a lot of money and time. What I'm saying when we talk about hybrid is that you just need to be intentional about the fact that it takes money and time, and not just that you can add it on to everything else that you've been doing. That's like anything else. If you decide we are going to now focus on social justice more, we're going to now as a congregation do an hour of becoming an anti-racist congregation. You don't just put that on top of everything else. You say, this is stuff that we can't do. So here's my last, or not last, I have 5 more minutes. Last words of kind of encouragement around money and resources. Don't be fancier than you are. I'm hearing about churches all over and pastors and communities like, if you have an iPhone, if you have an iPad or a tablet of some kind, if you're an Android person, whatever it is, you can make this work with whatever tools you have. In fact, if you look fancier than you are, all we're doing is lying to people about who we are as a community. I kind of think about if your website is aspirational and not true to who you are, and people show up and it's like, wait a minute, that online face that they have is not who they are, then all we've done with lie to them. So as you're thinking about this hybrid space, do not fall into the trap of thinking it takes a lot of money to do. You can do this in a variety of ways. I wish I could even talk to you more, but go to the Zoom group in Facebook and you can see how folks are yoking 3 congregations together and figuring out ways to do worship together. I mean, it will not take a lot of money, but it does take a realistic understanding of resources. So it might mean buying a better mic for $40, right? It could mean you need to upgrade your computer. It could, but it doesn't have to. I mean, there's this is not just about wealthy congregations. In fact, I think some of our wealthy, bigger congregations who have been streaming all this time are going to have a harder time moving into this hybrid space because the way technology and fixtures have been set up is to stream. Those churches that are smaller or weren't doing any of that at all, we are operating from a clean slate almost that we've got to build out and play with and experiment with over these last 9 or 10 months. And now we have a better understanding of what our capabilities are and our capacities are. So again, don't look fancier than you are. Use what you got. There are lots of alternatives and options to do this without spending a ton of money. So hopefully that answers. All right. I am almost out of time. Yes, the ongoing internet interaction piece, I think that is a constant piece. I think when you have low internet access, you begin to think about pre-recording a little bit more and figuring out alternatives to how people can gather on the phone or other pieces. I will admit, this hybrid experience in rural places, if your internet's not good, but again, internet is not good everywhere, but so that is certainly a piece that is going to take a little more thinking about. So again, there's limitations. Again, with whatever you decide in the future, there are limitations. There's just going to be limitations by who can join, how you can do that, limitations of our own leadership capacity, limitations of our technology or access to internet is certainly going to be one of them. So I think that with anything we decide about the church in the future, there are limitations. And I think that for us to believe otherwise tricks ourselves back into thinking when we would all say, well, everybody is welcome here, or we don't understand why people aren't coming, that we were limiting ourselves before pandemic. Decisions we make next will limit ourselves afterwards, and we will certainly continue as human beings, continue to find ways to limit ourselves in the future. All right, so I'm going to see if there are any last questions that I didn't touch on. There's so many here. So let me ask, I'm looking at the chat, if direct from either Anne or Tom, if there are certain things that we wanted to wanted me to address. And again, look in the chat. There's tons of great stuff floating around there. It's around technology and things that you can try to do. So again, I'm offering you one option in ways to drill down on this, but so many other ways to begin to lead your communities, whether you're in pastoral leadership or you're an educator, whatever your role is. Again, all of these things are possibilities and open us up to experiencing a table that is much more broad and expansive than we've ever experienced before. All right. It has been great being with you all. I actually don't know how we're ending this time. So we didn't talk about that when we did our run through. So I'm done. So there you go. We'll get those links out to you. And the awkward and loveliness of Zoom things. So thank you all for having me. I will see you at the chat later this evening, and we can interact some more.